My name is Montgomery Turner, and at 72 years old, I never imagined I would be fighting for my dignity after burying my only son, Richard. The day of his funeral remains a blur, but what followed was crystal clear. My daughter-in-law, Julia, transforming from grieving widow to cold-hearted executor overnight. Standing in that lawyer's office, watching her smirk as she promised I would never see a penny of my son's estate, I felt my world collapse. Before I share what happened next, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and subscribe to hear the full story. I spent my career as an aerospace engineer in Seattle, working for 40 years at a major aviation company before retiring about 10 years ago. My retirement coincided with the most devastating period of my life when I lost my wife Margaret to breast cancer. After 38 years of marriage, I found myself alone in our family home, surrounded by memories, but with no one to share them. Thank God for Richard, my only son. After Margaret passed, he became my primary connection to family and emotional support. We had always been close, but during those dark days, he truly showed what he was made of. He would drive over twice a week just to check on me, bringing groceries and often staying for dinner. Sometimes he would even spend the night in his old bedroom, claiming he was too tired to drive home, though I knew it was his way of making sure I wasn't alone too much. Richard had built quite a successful career as a software developer. Starting with a small consulting business in his 20s, he eventually grew it into a thriving company with over 50 employees specializing in security software. I was immensely proud of him, especially since I had played a small role in nurturing his interest in computers. For his 12th birthday, I had scraped together enough money to buy him his first computer, a clunky desktop that seemed revolutionary at the time. I still remember teaching him basic coding on that machine, watching his eyes light up when he created his first program that displayed "Hello World" on the screen. Even as his business grew and his schedule became increasingly demanding, Richard and I maintained our traditions. We went fishing every other Saturday on Lake Washington, just the two of us in his small boat, talking about everything and nothing. Once a month, we would go camping in the Olympic National Forest, a tradition we had started when he was just 8 years old. These outdoor excursions became our sacred time, a space where the pressures of work and daily life seemed to evaporate among the tall pines and clear mountain streams. 7 years ago, Richard met Julia at a charity gala for children with special needs. His company had donated a significant amount to the cause, and Julia was working as an event coordinator. When he first introduced us, I was impressed by her energy and apparent passion for helping others. She was attractive, articulate, and seemed genuinely interested in Richard for who he was, not just his growing success. I remember thinking she might be good for him, bringing some balance to his workaholic tendencies. Their wedding 3 years later was an elaborate affair held at one of Seattle's most exclusive venues overlooking Puget Sound. I noticed then how Julia seemed particularly focused on the expensive details, the designer dress, the premium open bar, the celebrity photographer she had insisted on flying in from New York. But I dismissed my concerns, assuming it was just wedding excitement and the desire for a memorable day. Shortly after their marriage, Richard and Julia purchased a stunning lakefront property about 20 miles from my home. It became the new gathering place for holidays and family events. The house was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the water, a gourmet kitchen where Julia liked to showcase her culinary skills, and a separate guest house where I occasionally stayed when our fishing trips ran late. Looking back, I can see how family dynamics began to change around this time. Julia started controlling Richard's schedule more and more. Our fishing trips were rescheduled, shortened, or canceled altogether due to suddenly important social engagements or business functions that Julia deemed essential. The camping trips dwindled from monthly to quarterly, then to just a couple times a year. More concerning was how Julia would subtly criticize Richard's relationship with me. I would overhear comments like, "You spend more time with your dad than with me," or "I understand he's lonely, but we need our own life too." She was clever enough to frame these criticisms as reasonable concerns, rather than the manipulative tactics they were. Richard, always conscious of balancing his responsibilities, began to seem torn between us. The birth of their son Thomas, 2 years ago, brought a temporary harmony to our family. I was overjoyed to become a grandfather, and Julia seemed to soften during this period, perhaps too busy with the baby to maintain her subtle campaign. I threw myself into the role of devoted grandpa, babysitting regularly to give the new parents a break. Those afternoons with little Thomas were precious, reminiscent of my early days with Richard, and I treasured each moment. But over the last year, Julia's coldness toward me intensified. When I would arrive to babysit, she would leave detailed instructions as if I were an incompetent stranger rather than an experienced father. She began canceling my time with Thomas at the last minute, claiming he was too fussy or not feeling well. Richard seemed oblivious to these machinations, or perhaps he simply wanted to believe in the facade of family harmony. Our last truly happy time together was Christmas, 6 months before the tragedy. Richard had given me a beautiful custom fishing rod, handcrafted by an artisan he had tracked down in Montana. For our next 20 years of fishing trips, the card had read. That night, after Julia had gone to bed, Richard confided in me that he had made some precautionary legal arrangements recently. He didn't elaborate, only saying that he wanted to make sure everyone he loved was protected. I didn't press him for details, assuming we had plenty of time for such serious conversations. The final conversation I had with my son was about his upcoming business trip to Boston. He called to tell me he'd have to miss our scheduled fishing date that weekend. "I'll make it up to you when I get back, Dad," he promised. "Maybe we can do an overnight trip, like we used to." Those were the last words I would ever hear from my son, a promise of future time together that would never come. The phone call came at 11:30 at night, jarring me from a light sleep. An unfamiliar voice identified himself as Officer Brennan from the state police. There had been an accident on the interstate, he explained. A tractor trailer had jackknifed during a heavy rainstorm, causing a multi-car pileup. Richard's car had been among those involved. I remember asking if he was all right, even though something in the officer's tone had already told me the answer. "I'm very sorry, sir," the officer said. "Your son was transported to Harborview Medical Center, but his injuries were too severe. The shock was physical, like being plunged into ice water." I dressed mechanically, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly button my shirt. The 15-minute drive to the hospital remains a blur in my memory. I know I ran at least one red light, my mind unable to process anything except the desperate need to reach my son, as if my presence might somehow reverse what had happened. By the time I arrived at the hospital, it was too late to say goodbye. Richard had been pronounced dead 30 minutes earlier. When I reached the emergency department, I found Julia already there, speaking with hospital administrators. Her eyes were dry as she filled out paperwork with steady hands. When she saw me, she nodded briefly before returning to her conversation with the staff. "Julia," I said, my voice breaking. "Richard, is he really?" "Yes," she replied flatly. "They did everything they could, apparently." Her composure struck me as strange, but grief affects people differently, I told myself. I asked to see Richard, to have a moment with him, and a compassionate nurse led me to a small room where my son's body lay covered with a sheet. The sight of his still face, peaceful but unmistakably empty of the vibrant personality that had animated it, made the reality crash down upon me. I collapsed into the chair beside the bed, clutching his already cooling hand. I don't know how long I sat there before a staff member gently informed me that they needed to move him. In a daze, I walked back to the waiting area where my grandson Thomas had arrived with Julia's mother. The 2-year-old, too young to understand what was happening, ran to me with his arms outstretched. Just as I bent to embrace him, Julia swooped in and pulled him away. "He's overtired and confused," she said, not meeting my eyes. "We should get him home." The next morning, I drove to their house, bringing breakfast and coffee as an excuse to check on them and offer support. When I arrived, I found Julia already meeting with funeral directors in the living room, her parents flanking her on the sofa like sentinels. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, presumably with a nanny or relative in another part of the house. Montgomery, Julia acknowledged me with a nod. We're just finalizing the service arrangements. I thought we might discuss those together, I said carefully, setting down the untouched breakfast items on a side table. There's really no need, her father interjected. Julia has it under control. And so began a pattern that would characterize the following days. Julia took complete control of the funeral arrangements, systematically ignoring my input or suggestions. When I asked if we could include the reading of Richard's favorite poem, a Robert Frost piece we had often recited on our camping trips, Julia dismissed it as not appropriate for the tone of the service. When I suggested that some of Richard's fishing buddies might want to speak, she informed me that the eulogies had already been assigned to business associates who really knew Richard's accomplishments. The funeral service itself was large and impersonal, held in a cavernous downtown church that Richard had visited perhaps twice in his lifetime. The pews were filled with business associates, social connections, and Julia's extensive family, but I noticed the absence of many people who had been meaningful parts of Richard's life. His college roommate who had helped him start his business, his longtime assistant who had been with him from the beginning, and several of our mutual friends from the neighborhood. I found myself relegated to the second row, while Julia and her family occupied the front pew with little Thomas, dressed in a miniature black suit, squirming uncomfortably between his maternal grandparents. When I had asked Julia earlier if I could sit with them, she had explained that the front row needed to be immediate family only, a distinction that cut deeply. During the service, I clutched the folded pages of the eulogy I had prepared but would not be allowed to deliver. Instead, I listened as Richard's business partner gave a speech focused primarily on his professional achievements, followed by Julia's brother recounting anecdotes that portrayed a version of Richard I I hardly recognized. There was no mention of his gentle humor, his love of nature, or his incredible patience and kindness. The Richard being memorialized was a successful businessman and social figure, not the son I had raised and loved. After the final prayers, as people began to file out, Thomas spotted me and broke free from his grandmother's grasp. He ran down the aisle to me, his little face brightening in recognition. "Grandpa," he called, throwing his arms around my legs. This simple moment of connection, the warmth of his small body against mine, brought the first genuine emotional release of the day. I knelt down to his level, holding him close, breathing in the sweet child scent of his hair. "I miss Daddy," he whispered in my ear, and my heart shattered anew. Before I could respond, Julia appeared, swiftly extracting Thomas from my embrace. "The cars are waiting," she said curtly. "We need to get to the house for the reception." The reception at Richard and Julia's home felt like an extension of the impersonal service. Catering staff circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres and flutes of champagne, creating an atmosphere more suited to a corporate function than a gathering to mourn my son. I stood awkwardly near the fireplace, clutching a glass of water, feeling like an intruder in the home where I had once been a welcome guest. Several times, people approached me to offer condolences or share memories of Richard, only to be intercepted by Julia or one of her family members. "Let me introduce you to Richard's business partner," she would say, smoothly steering them away. "He can tell you about the amazing project they were working on." At one point, I noticed that the memorial display of photographs, prominently positioned in the entryway, contained no images from Richard's childhood or our family activities. When I mentioned this to Julia, asking specifically about the absence of Richard's childhood photo album, she dismissed my concern. "We wanted to focus on his accomplishments as an adult," she explained. "Not everyone needs to see old vacation photos." As the afternoon wore on, I overheard a conversation between Julia and her brother in the kitchen, their voices carrying through the partially open door. "The attorney said the estate should be settled quickly," her brother was saying. "With the business valuation, you're looking at quite a substantial sum." "I know," Julia replied. "And there's the life insurance, too. I'll be meeting with a financial advisor next week to discuss investment options." There was no mention of Richard himself. of the loss or the grief, only the cold calculation of assets now available. Sickened, I slipped out of the house without saying goodbye, unable to bear another moment in that environment, so devoid of genuine mourning. Back in my empty house, I finally allowed myself to break down, sobbing uncontrollably as I clutched the fishing rod Richard had given me at Christmas. That beautiful gift, intended for future adventures together, now stood as a cruel reminder of all the moments we would never share. For the first time, I faced the terrible reality that my son was truly gone, and with him, it seemed, my place in the life he had built. The day after the funeral, I called Julia to ask about visiting Thomas. My grandson would be confused and grieving in his own limited way, and I hoped that maintaining our connection might provide him some comfort and continuity. The phone rang several times before Julia answered, her voice immediately taking on an irritated tone when she heard my voice. "Montgomery, this isn't a good time," she said before I could even mention my reason for calling. "I'm dealing with 1,000 things right now." "I understand you're busy," I said carefully. "I was just hoping to see Thomas. Maybe take him to the park for an hour or two to give you some space." "That's not going to work," she replied. "He's too upset for outings, and frankly, having people coming and going will just make things more chaotic. I need to establish a routine again." "When might be a better time?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation from my voice. "I'll let you know," she said vaguely. "I have to go now. The insurance adjuster is here." That call set the pattern for the week that followed. My messages went unreturned. My texts received only the briefest acknowledgments. Each time, Julia was too busy, or Thomas was not up for visitors. By the 8th day after Richard's funeral, concern and frustration drove me to drive to their house unannounced. As I turned onto their street, I was surprised to see several large moving trucks parked in the driveway and along the curb. Workers in uniform were carrying boxes and furniture out of the house and loading them into the trucks. Confused, I parked my car and approached the open front door, where a supervisor was checking items off a clipboard. "Excuse me," I said. "What's going on here? Where's Julia?" The man glanced up briefly. "In the back office, ma'am. But we're on a tight schedule, so try not to get in the way." I made my way through the house, shocked to see Richard's home office being systematically dismantled. His computer equipment was being packed into crates, his bookshelves already empty, the fishing gear and nature photographs that had decorated the walls now stacked in cardboard boxes labeled donation and storage. I found Julia in the master bedroom, directing 2 workers who were removing Richard's clothing from the walk-in closet. She looked up with irritation when I appeared in the doorway. "Montgomery," she said flatly, "I'm rather busy at the moment." "What is happening?" I demanded, gesturing toward the activity throughout the house. "Why are you packing up Richard's things?" "I'm downsizing," she replied coolly. "This house is too big for just Thomas and me, and I'm clearing out things we don't need." "Without telling me? These are Richard's belongings. Some of these things have been in our family for years." "These things," she emphasized, "are mine now. I'll decide what happens to them." "Could I at least have some of his personal items?" I asked, my voice catching. The fishing equipment, some photographs, his old journals from when he was young. Julia's expression hardened. "Everything valuable needs to be properly appraised for the estate. If there's anything left after that process, we can discuss it." As we spoke, I noticed movement at the top of the stairs. Thomas stood there in his pajamas, clutching his favorite stuffed animal, watching the strangers dismantle his home. When he spotted me, his face brightened. "Grandpa," he called, starting down the stairs. Julia immediately moved to intercept him. "Thomas, go back to your room. Nanny Karen will be up in a minute with your snack." To me, she added in a lower voice, "This is exactly the kind of disruption I was trying to avoid. You're upsetting him." "I'm upsetting him? You're packing up his father's things without any warning or preparation." "Please leave now," Julia said firmly, "or I'll have to ask the movers to escort you out." Over the next few weeks, I made several attempts to visit the house, each time finding fewer and fewer traces of Richard's presence. The boat was gone from its dock. The workshop where he had built furniture as a hobby had been converted into a home gym. His collection of first edition nature books had vanished from the library shelves. On my fourth visit, when I used the emergency key Richard had given me years ago, I discovered the locks had been changed. I stood on the porch, key uselessly in hand, when my cell phone rang. It was Julia. "The security system just alerted me to someone at the front door," she said coldly. "I suggest you leave immediately, Montgomery. The next time you attempt to enter my home without permission, I will report you for trespassing." That evening, I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It was from Richard's longtime assistant, Samantha. "Mr. Turner, I'm so sorry to bother you. Julia terminated my position today and asked me to clear out my desk immediately. I saved a flash drive with some family photos and videos from Richard's computer before they wiped the drives. I'd like to get it to you if possible." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop the following day, where Samantha, a kind woman in her 30s who had worked with Richard for over a decade, handed me a small envelope containing the drive. "She's selling everything," Samantha confided in a low voice. "The office equipment, the company vehicle, even the client list. Richard's partner is trying to stop her, but she has the controlling interest now." As Samantha was leaving, she hesitated, then turned back to me. "There's something else you should know," she said reluctantly. "Julia has been seeing someone, a financial advisor she met through the estate process. It started about 2 weeks after the funeral. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me given Julia's behavior, but it still felt like a physical blow. Not even a month after burying my son, she was already moving on, erasing his existence from the life they had shared. The final insult came when Dave, one of Richard's fishing buddies, called to tell me he'd seen Richard's custom boat for sale at a dealer in Tacoma. "I thought you should know," he said awkwardly. "I recognized it right away. All the gear was still in it, even that special tackle box you made for him." The stress and grief began to take a physical toll. I lost weight, my blood pressure spiked, and sleep became elusive. Night after night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how the woman Richard had chosen to share his life with could so completely betray his memory and cut out the people who had truly loved him. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a formal letter from a law firm representing Julia. The envelope, thick and official-looking, with an embossed return address, contained a 6-page document filled with legal terminology. The essential message, once I waded through the jargon, was a demand that I return any of Richard's property that might be in my possession, specifically including gifts that may not have been properly documented or legally transferred prior to the decedent's passing. They were asking for the fishing rod, the Christmas gift from my son. The last present he had ever given me was being reclaimed as an asset of the estate. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands, as a new wave of grief and anger washed over me. The next day, I drove to the county records office, hoping to learn more about Richard's will and the status of his estate. The clerk was sympathetic, but limited in what she could tell me. "Probate records are public," she explained, "but the will hasn't been officially filed yet. Until then, I can't provide specific information." She did confirm, however, that Richard's estate was substantial, including not only his personal assets but also life insurance policies and business holdings that would amount to several $1,000,000. The thought that Julia was now controlling this fortune while simultaneously cutting me out of Thomas's life was almost unbearable. That evening, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through social media, something I rarely did. Julia had always been active on various platforms, carefully curating an image of perfect family life. Now, her recent posts showed a startling change. Just weeks after Richard's death, she was posting photos of herself in expensive new clothes, at luxury resorts, and at high-end restaurants. In one particularly galling image, she posed on the deck of a yacht that looked suspiciously like one belonging to Richard's business competitor, champagne glass in hand, her expression far from grief-stricken. Desperate for guidance, I made an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in estate matters. Howard Green was a man about my age, with kind eyes and a straightforward manner that I appreciated. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Turner," he said after hearing my story. "The legal rights of parents versus a spouse are quite limited in these situations. Unless your son specifically provided for you in his will or created a separate trust for certain assets, most everything would typically pass to his wife." "What about my rights as a grandparent?" I asked. "Surely I have some legal standing to maintain a relationship with Thomas." Howard's expression grew even more somber. "Grandparent visitation rights are among the most difficult to enforce, especially when the surviving parent is deemed fit by the court. Unless you can prove that Julia is somehow harming Thomas by denying your access, it would be an uphill battle." I left his office with a heavy heart, the legal consultation having confirmed my worst fears. Julia held all the cards, and my connection to my grandson hung by the slimmest of threads. A few days later, fate brought us face to face when I stopped for lunch at Richard's favorite waterfront restaurant, a place we had frequented for our father-son dinners. I had gone there seeking some connection to him, a place where memories of our conversations still lingered. I was halfway through my meal when Julia walked in with an unfamiliar man, well-dressed and significantly younger than her. They were seated at a table across the room, but despite the distance, I knew she had seen me. Throughout their meal, she never once glanced in my direction, laughing and talking with her companion as if they hadn't a care in the world. When they rose to leave, they passed directly by my table. I looked up, expecting at least a minimal acknowledgement, but Julia stared straight ahead, as if I were invisible. The man with her, noticing her sudden tension, gave me a curious glance, but followed her lead in pretending I didn't exist. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Julia's parents. Her father's voice was cold and accusatory. "Montgomery, this has to stop," he began without preamble. "Julia told us you showed up at her lunch today. Following her around is bordering on harassment." "I wasn't following anyone," I protested. "I was having lunch at a restaurant Richard and I used to visit." "That's hardly believable given the timing," he retorted. "Listen carefully. Julia is trying to rebuild her life after a terrible tragedy. The last thing she needs is her father-in-law stalking her and creating scenes in public." "Creating scenes? I didn't even speak to her." "Just stay away," he warned. "She's been more than generous considering the circumstances." "Generous?" I echoed in disbelief. "She's cut me off from my grandson, claimed back gifts from my son, and is selling off his possessions without any regard for their sentimental value. How exactly is that generous?" "Richard made his choice when he made his will," her father said cryptically before hanging up. The implication that Richard had deliberately excluded me from his will struck deep. Had my son really intended to leave me nothing, not even continued connection to his child? It seemed completely at odds with the relationship we had shared. But Julia and her family seemed so confident. A few days later, I received a call from Michael, one of Richard's longtime friends who had attended a different college. He seemed hesitant, uncomfortable. "Montgomery, there's something you should know," he said after some awkward small talk. "Julia has been telling people that you were a distant father to Richard. She's saying you only became involved in his life after he became successful, that you were essentially absent during his childhood." The accusation was so outrageous that I actually laughed in shock. That's absurd. I raised Richard as a single father for most of his teenage years after his mother died. We were incredibly close his entire life. "I know that," Michael assured me. "Anyone who knew Richard knows how much he valued your relationship. But Julia is, she's creating a narrative that supports her actions now." This character assassination was a new low, but explained the strange looks I had received at the funeral and why some mutual friends had seemed to be avoiding me. Julia wasn't content with taking Richard's assets. She was now trying to rewrite our history to justify her behavior. A week later, I received an unexpected visitor. Daniel Harper, Richard's business partner, appeared at my door, looking troubled. After some hesitation, he shared his concerns about Julia's plans for the company. She's talking about selling to our biggest competitor, he explained. They've made an offer that's well below market value, but she seems determined to take it. I tried to explain that Richard would have never agreed to this, that he built the company to be independent, but she wouldn't listen. Why would she sell at a loss? I asked, puzzled. Daniel looked uncomfortable. The buyer is Travis Mercer. They've been seen together socially several times now. The picture was becoming clearer. Julia wasn't just moving on. She was systematically dismantling the life Richard had built and replacing it with one of her own design, with no regard for his wishes or legacy. As the 6-month anniversary of Richard's death approached, I noticed another disturbing development. All photos featuring me had been removed from Richard's social media accounts, which Julia now controlled. Family events were reframed to exclude my presence, creating a digital record that aligned with her fiction of my minimal role in Richard's life. My finances, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly strained. Medical bills from a recent hospitalization for stress-related chest pains had piled up, and my fixed retirement income left little room for unexpected expenses. When my aging car broke down that same week, I found myself thinking of how Richard would have insisted on helping, either fixing it himself or making sure I got a fair deal at the mechanic. Instead, I was on my own, dipping into my limited savings to cover the repair costs. As I waited in the service center, my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from a name I didn't immediately recognize. It was Julia's brother. "Just a friendly heads up," the message read. "You might want to prepare yourself for disappointment regarding the will reading next week. Julia has made sure everything is airtight." I hadn't even been informed that the will reading had been scheduled. The casual cruelty of learning this crucial information through a taunting message rather than proper notification felt like yet another deliberate slight. The next day, I finally received the official notice from the attorney's office about the will reading, scheduled for the following Wednesday at 10 in the morning. The formal letter contained no personal note, no acknowledgement of my relationship to Richard, just the cold details of time and place. The night before the reading, unable to sleep, I found the courage to open the box of family albums I had been avoiding since Richard's death. Turning the pages slowly, I traced the arc of my son's life through photographs. His first steps, school plays, graduation, the camping trips where his face shone with happiness beneath the mountain sky. These images told the true story of our relationship, one of presence and love, not the fiction Julia had been creating. As dawn broke, I resolved to face whatever came next with the dignity Richard would have expected from me. I would not allow Julia's actions to tarnish the beautiful relationship I had shared with my son, regardless of what his will might contain. The morning of the will reading dawned clear and unseasonably warm for Seattle in early spring. I dressed with care in my best suit, the one I had worn to Richard's college graduation and later to his wedding. Though slightly outdated and a bit loose now, due to my recent weight loss, it felt appropriate for this final official act related to my son. The attorney's office was located in a gleaming downtown skyscraper, its glass and steel exterior reflecting the morning sunlight. The lobby was all marble and soft lighting, speaking of money and influence. I gave my name to the receptionist, a young woman with a practiced smile who checked her computer before looking up at me with what seemed like pity in her eyes. "Mr. Turner, yes. They're not quite ready for you upstairs. If you'd like to take a seat, someone will come down to escort you when they're ready to begin." I sat alone in the cavernous lobby for nearly 30 minutes, watching well-dressed professionals hurry past with coffee cups and briefcases, their lives continuing uninterrupted by grief or loss. Just as I was considering asking the receptionist for an update, the elevator doors opened, and a small group emerged. Julia walked at the center, 20 minutes late but making an entrance nonetheless. She wore an expensive-looking black dress that managed to suggest mourning while remaining fashionable, accessorized with pearl earrings I recognized as a gift from Richard on their first anniversary. Behind her trailed her parents, her brother, and 2 women I didn't recognize but assumed were friends, or perhaps advisors of some sort. She spotted me immediately, but made no acknowledgement as she approached the reception desk. "Julia Dawson Turner," she announced, as if her arrival were a significant event. "We're here for the Turner estate reading." "Yes, Mrs. Turner, the receptionist replied. Mr. Wilson is ready for you now. I'll have someone escort your party up. As we waited for the escort, Julia engaged in loud conversation with her entourage, discussing plans for renovating the house and an upcoming trip to Europe. Though she never looked directly at me, her voice carried clearly in the marble lobby, ensuring I could hear every word. I'm thinking of converting that old workshop into a proper yoga studio, she was saying. It's such a waste of space as it is, and the water view would be so calming during meditation. That old workshop had been Richard's sanctuary, the place where he had lovingly crafted furniture, including the cradle for Thomas. The casual dismissal of this special place felt like another deliberate wound. A young man in a tailored suit appeared and led us to a private elevator. The short ride up 32 floors was silent and tense, with Julia and her group clustered at one end of the car, while I stood alone at the other. The elevator opened directly into the law firm's reception area, where another assistant greeted us and directed us to a large conference room. The room was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains beyond. A long mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by plush leather chairs. Julia immediately directed her group to sit on one side of the table, leaving me to take a seat alone on the opposite side. I carefully placed my worn leather wallet on the table before me, opened to display a small photo of Richard that I always carried. After a few minutes, the door opened, and Thomas Wilson entered. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with silver temples and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic air. He carried a leather portfolio and was followed by a younger colleague wheeling a small cart with refreshments. "Good morning, everyone," Wilson began formally. "I'm Thomas Wilson, the attorney who drew up Richard's will and the executor of his estate. I appreciate you all being here today. Before we begin, can I offer anyone coffee or water?" Julia and her parents accepted coffee, while I asked for water, my throat already dry with apprehension. Once the beverages were distributed, Wilson opened his portfolio and extracted several official-looking documents. "I'll begin by explaining the purpose and structure of today's proceeding," he said, his tone professional, but not unkind. "We are here for the formal reading of Richard Michael Turner's last will and testament, dated January 15th of this year, approximately 6 months before his unfortunate passing." He proceeded to outline the technical details of the estate, using legal terminology that sometimes went over my head. The estate's total valuation was significant, including not only the lakefront property valued at just over $2 million, but also investment accounts, retirement funds, multiple life insurance policies, and Richard's 70% ownership stake in his software company, currently valued at around $4 million. As Wilson began reading the actual will, starting with the standard legal preamble, I noticed Julia's expression growing increasingly triumphant. She sat straighter in her chair, occasionally exchanging satisfied glances with her parents. "To my wife, Julia Elizabeth Turner," Wilson read, "I leave our primary residence at 1720 Lakeside Drive, including all furnishings and personal property therein." Julia nodded, as if this were merely confirming what she already knew. "Additionally, I leave to Julia the following: all vehicles registered in my name, all financial accounts held jointly or individually at First Northwest Bank and Columbia Investment Group, and my life insurance policies naming her as beneficiary." With each item, Julia's smile grew more pronounced. I felt my heart sinking, though I had expected this outcome. Of course, Richard would provide generously for his wife and the mother of his child. Wilson continued reading through several more specific bequests: a donation to Richard's alma mater, gifts to several longtime employees, and a trust fund established for Thomas that would provide for his education and give him access to capital at age 25. As the reading progressed, I felt increasingly lightheaded and realized I had been holding my breath. Wilson paused, looking at me with concern. "Mr. Turner, are you feeling all right? Would you like to take a short break?" Before I could respond, Julia interjected. "Don't worry about him," she said dismissively. "He's just disappointed he won't get his hands on my money." Wilson's expression shifted, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes as he regarded Julia. "Mrs. Turner, I'd appreciate it if we could maintain a respectful atmosphere." He returned to the document, reading through several more technical provisions regarding the administration of the estate. Finally, he reached what appeared to be the conclusion. "All remaining property, both real and personal, not specifically bequeathed above, I leave to my wife, Julia Elizabeth Turner, as the primary beneficiary of my estate." The finality of these words hung in the air. I had been completely excluded, not even mentioned in my son's will. Despite preparing myself for this possibility, the reality was devastating. Julia turned to look directly at me for the first time that day, her expression one of undisguised triumph. "Well, there it is, Montgomery. As I told you from the beginning, you won't get a cent from your son's will. I promise you that." The cruelty of her statement in that formal setting, in front of witnesses, showed how confident she was in her victory. I felt myself shrinking in my chair, the weight of grief and humiliation threatening to crush me. But then something unexpected happened. Thomas Wilson smiled. It was a small, restrained expression, but unmistakable. "Actually," he said, reaching back into his portfolio, "there is one more item left to address." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Julia's triumphant smile faltered as Wilson extracted a sealed envelope from his briefcase, placing it carefully on the table before him. "This envelope," he explained, "contains additional documents that Richard prepared and entrusted to me with specific instructions regarding their disclosure." Julia's expression transformed from confusion to concern. "What additional documents?" "The will is complete. You just read it." "The will is indeed complete," Wilson agreed smoothly. "However, Richard also established a separate legal instrument, specifically a living trust, approximately 6 months before his passing. As per his instructions, the details of this trust were to be revealed only after the reading of his will. 6 months ago would have been right around Christmas, I realized, when Richard had mentioned making precautionary legal arrangements. My heartbeat quickened as Wilson broke the seal on the envelope and removed a thick document bound with a blue cover. "This trust, formally titled the Richard M. Turner Legacy Trust," Wilson continued, "was established as a separate entity from the estate covered by the will we just reviewed." Julia leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Wilson explained patiently, "that certain assets were transferred into this trust during Richard's lifetime, and therefore are not part of the estate governed by the will. Assets in a trust bypass the probate process entirely." He opened the document and began to read. "I, Richard Michael Turner, being of sound mind, hereby establish this irrevocable trust for the purposes outlined herein. The primary assets of this trust consist of my business interests in Turner Security Solutions, Incorporated, including but not limited to my 70% ownership stake, all intellectual property associated with the business, and the commercial real estate at 455 Tech Plaza, where the business operations are housed." I felt a rush of confusion. Richard had placed his most valuable asset, his company, in a separate trust outside of the will. Julia appeared equally surprised, her face paling slightly. "The approximate value of these business interests," Wilson continued, "is $4,700,000, based on the most recent business valuation." Julia's brother whispered something to her, and she raised a hand to silence him, her eyes never leaving Wilson's face. "As to the beneficiaries of this trust," Wilson read, his voice clear and steady, "I hereby name my father, Montgomery James Turner, as the primary beneficiary, to receive income from the business operations for the duration of his natural life, with the principal to pass to my son, Thomas Richard Turner, upon my father's passing." The words hung in the air for a moment before their meaning fully registered. I was the primary beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar trust containing Richard's most valuable asset. My son had ensured I would be taken care of after all. Julia's face had drained of all color. "This can't be legal," she protested. "I was never informed of this trust." "That's not unusual," Wilson replied calmly. "The creation of a trust is a private matter and doesn't require spousal notification, particularly when it involves separate property, such as a business founded before the marriage." He continued reading. "I have chosen this arrangement after careful consideration. My father was instrumental in fostering my interest in technology from an early age and provided the emotional and sometimes financial support that allowed me to build my company. It is my wish that he benefit from the success he helped make possible." Tears welled in my eyes at these words, this acknowledgement of our shared journey. Even in death, Richard had found a way to express his love and gratitude. Wilson was still reading. "Additionally, I have made this arrangement based on certain concerns about the management of my assets after my passing. Specifically, approximately 8 months ago, I installed security cameras in our home after noticing unusual patterns in our financial accounts. The footage from these cameras is included in the media appendix to this trust document." Julia gasped audibly. "What footage? What cameras? This is an invasion of privacy." Without responding directly to her outburst, Wilson removed a small tablet from his briefcase, tapped the screen a few times, and then turned it to face us. On the screen was a video of Julia, in what appeared to be her home office, speaking on the phone. "Of course I married him for his money," her recorded voice said clearly. "Do you think I'd put up with his boring tech talk and family fishing trips otherwise? His company is going to be worth 8 figures in a few years, and half of that will be mine. I just need to keep playing the devoted wife until then." The timestamp on the video showed a date just over 8 months ago. Julia stared at the screen in horror as her own voice continued, discussing how she could maximize her financial position and minimize Montgomery's access to their son. Wilson stopped the playback after about 30 seconds. "There are approximately 6 hours of similar recordings," he said quietly. "Richard reviewed them all and made copies before consulting with me about his options." Julia's attorney, a thin man who had been silent until now, leaned over to whisper urgently in her ear. She pushed him away angrily. "This is all an obvious setup," she declared. "Those recordings could easily be manipulated." "They have been authenticated by 2 independent experts," Wilson replied. "Their affidavits are included in the trust documentation. But even setting aside the recordings, the trust itself is legally binding." He turned a page and continued reading. "Further provisions of this trust stipulate that my wife, Julia Elizabeth Turner, shall have the following options regarding the family residence. She may either ensure that my father, Montgomery Turner, has lifetime residency rights in the guest house on the property, with full access to common areas, including the lakefront, or she may choose to forfeit the residence entirely, in which case it will be sold and the proceeds divided, with 70% added to Thomas's education trust and 30% provided directly to Montgomery for the purchase of a new residence." This unexpected provision hit me like a physical blow. Richard had found a way to ensure I wouldn't be completely cut off from my grandson, offering Julia a choice that protected both Thomas's inheritance and my connection to him. Wilson wasn't finished. "The trust further stipulates that Montgomery Turner shall have guaranteed visitation rights with his grandson, Thomas, consisting of no less than 2 weekends per month and 1 extended visit of at least 5 days during summer school breaks. These visitation rights are a condition of Julia's continued residence in the family home. Should she interfere with these visits, the same forfeiture provision described above will take effect." Julia had begun to tremble visibly. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Her parents exchanged alarmed glances while her brother stared stonily ahead. "As trustee," Wilson added, setting aside the formal document for a moment, "I feel I should inform everyone present that I have been documenting Julia's actions since Richard's passing, including the selling of personal property, attempts to liquidate business assets, and denial of Montgomery's access to his grandson. All of these actions will be relevant should any party contest the provisions of this trust." He returned to the document for one final revelation. "Should Julia Elizabeth Turner contest any portion of this trust or attempt legal action to invalidate its provisions, The trust is structured with a contest clause, specifying that she will forfeit all benefits provided to her in both this trust and in my will, with all assets to be divided between Montgomery Turner and a college fund for Thomas Richard Turner. The implications of this final provision hung heavy in the air. If Julia fought the trust, she risked losing everything. Her attorney was now frantically writing notes on a legal pad, occasionally shaking his head in what appeared to be dismay. Wilson closed the document and looked around the table. "Are there any questions about the provisions as I've outlined them?" Julia's face had gone from pale to flushed, her breathing rapid and shallow. Without warning, she suddenly slumped sideways in her chair, sliding toward the floor as her mother cried out in alarm. Her father and brother jumped up to catch her, easing her unconscious form onto the carpeted floor. "She's fainted," her mother announced dramatically. "Call an ambulance. This stress is too much." As Julia's entourage clustered around her, Wilson quietly moved to sit beside me, bringing along his portfolio. While the commotion continued, he discreetly showed me additional papers. "These document Julia's financial activities since Richard's passing," he explained in a low voice. "She sold over $300,000 worth of personal property, attempted to negotiate a below-market sale of the company to a business competitor she's romantically involved with, and has withdrawn nearly $50,000 from joint accounts for personal luxury purchases." I watched as Julia's parents fanned her face with a folder, her eyelids already fluttering as she began to regain consciousness. "Richard knew, didn't he?" I asked quietly. "He knew what she really was." Wilson nodded solemnly. "He suspected for some time, but couldn't bring himself to end the marriage because of Thomas. Instead, he created this trust to protect you and his son after he was gone. He was an exceptionally thoughtful man." As Julia was helped back into her chair, still looking dazed but very much conscious, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication that Richard had seen through her facade, profound gratitude for his foresight in protecting me, but also deep sadness that he had lived his final years in a marriage built on deception. Wilson returned to his place at the head of the table, his professional demeanor firmly back in place. "Given the circumstances, I suggest we adjourn for today. Mrs. Turner may wish to consult with her attorney regarding her options under the trust provisions. Montgomery, I'll need to speak with you privately about the business transition, as you'll be taking on certain responsibilities as beneficiary." Julia, now recovered enough to understand what was happening, glared at me with naked hatred, but beneath that hatred, I could see something else: fear. For the first time since Richard's death, the power dynamic between us had shifted dramatically, and we both knew it. The days following the will reading were a flurry of legal activity and negotiations. Julia's attorney requested copies of all trust documents and the video evidence, presumably to assess whether they had any grounds to contest the provisions. Wilson advised me that this was standard procedure and not necessarily an indication that she would challenge the trust. "The contest clause is very strong," he explained during one of our meetings at his office. "If she fights this and loses, she gets nothing. Her attorney will almost certainly advise her to comply with the terms." I found myself in the strange position of holding significant leverage after months of feeling powerless. Yet what I wanted most couldn't be negotiated in legal terms: a peaceful relationship with Julia for Thomas's sake, and the opportunity to maintain a meaningful connection with my grandson. Within a week, I received the keys to the guest house on Richard's property. Moving into that small but beautiful space overlooking the lake brought a bittersweet mixture of emotions. While I was grateful for the proximity to Thomas, the property was haunted with memories of Richard, from the dock where we had launched countless fishing trips to the fire pit where we had told stories under the stars. Julia, under the watchful eye of Wilson as trustee, reluctantly established a visitation schedule that allowed me regular time with Thomas. Our first weekend together was slightly awkward, with the 2-year-old initially shy after our months of separation. But children are remarkably resilient, and by Saturday afternoon, he was chattering excitedly as we built sandcastles by the lake and fed the ducks that gathered near the shore. "Daddy used to do this with me," he said suddenly, as we tossed breadcrumbs into the water. "He did," I confirmed gently. Your daddy loved the lake and all the animals that live here. Mommy says daddy is in heaven now, Thomas continued, his small face serious. Is heaven far away? How does one explain death to a child so young? I knelt beside him, choosing my words carefully. Heaven isn't a place we can visit, but your daddy is always with you in your heart. And when you're with me, we can talk about him as much as you want. Thomas considered this, then nodded solemnly. I remember when Daddy let me steer the boat, he said. Can we go in a boat someday? Absolutely, I promised, making a mental note to look into purchasing a small rowboat we could use safely near the shore. A few days after that first visit, I made an unexpected discovery. While arranging my books in the guest house's small study, I noticed that one section of the bookshelf seemed slightly different from the rest. Curious, I pressed against it and was surprised when a small hidden compartment slid open, revealing a leather-bound journal. Inside, written in Richard's distinctive handwriting, was a message on the first page. For my father when the time is right. With love, Richard. With trembling hands, I began to read. The journal contained Richard's private thoughts about his marriage, his growing realization of Julia's true nature, and his fears for both Thomas's future and my welfare. The entries spanned the last year of his life, documenting his discovery of Julia's infidelity, her disdain for his family traditions, and her casual cruelty when she thought no one was watching. I cannot bring myself to end the marriage, he had written, because I cannot bear the thought of Thomas being shuttled between homes, or worse, being raised primarily by Julia without my daily influence. Instead, I am putting safeguards in place that will protect both Dad and Thomas if anything should happen to me. Dad's innate kindness sometimes blinds him to the manipulation of others, but he is Thomas's best chance at understanding what true integrity looks like. Reading these words, I wept for my son's silent suffering and his courage in protecting those he loved, even while enduring such personal unhappiness. The journal became my most precious possession, a final gift that allowed me to understand Richard's final years in a way our conversations never had. Over the following weeks, a tense but functional relationship developed between Julia and me. Under the terms of the trust, she could not prevent my involvement in Thomas's life without serious financial consequences. Wilson had made it clear that as trustee, he would be monitoring the situation closely. Rather than risk losing everything, Julia gradually accepted the new reality, though she rarely spoke to me directly, preferring to communicate through nannies or written notes about Thomas's schedule. I found unexpected purpose in my new role as beneficiary of Richard's business. Though day-to-day operations continued under the capable management of Daniel Harper, Richard's partner, I took an active interest in understanding the company my son had built. Daniel patiently explained the business model, the company's industry standing, and the innovative security solutions that had made Turner Security a respected name in the field. Richard was incredibly proud of this company, Daniel told me over lunch at the office one day, but he was even more proud of his relationship with you. He talked about your camping trips all the time, used lessons you taught him as analogies in business meetings. That fishing rod of yours hanging in his office wasn't just decoration. It was a symbol of everything he valued. Using a portion of the trust income, I established a scholarship in Richard's name at his alma mater, specifically for students interested in combining technology with environmental conservation, two of his greatest passions. The first recipient was a promising young woman developing software to monitor salmon populations in Northwest rivers, a cause Richard had supported. The first truly significant thaw in relations with Julia came unexpectedly, about 4 months after the will reading. Thomas had been invited to a birthday party, and through some miscommunication, both Julia and I arrived to pick him up at the same time. Rather than create an awkward scene, Julia surprised me by suggesting we all get ice cream together before heading home. Sitting at that small ice cream parlor, watching Thomas gleefully attack a chocolate sundae almost as big as his head, Julia spoke directly to me for the first time in months. I know you must hate me, she said quietly, while Thomas was distracted by his dessert. I don't hate you, Julia, I replied honestly. I hate what you did, how you behaved after Richard died, but hatred takes too much energy that I'd rather spend on Thomas." She was silent for a moment, using her spoon to push melting ice cream around her dish. "I wasn't always the person you saw after the funeral," she finally said. "When I first met Richard, I did care for him. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what mattered. I got caught up in the lifestyle, the status, the money." "Richard knew," I said gently. "But he stayed because of Thomas." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I've started therapy," she admitted. "Not just because of the trust stipulations, but because I don't like who I became. Thomas deserves better." That conversation didn't magically transform our relationship into a warm friendship, but it did mark the beginning of a more civil coexistence focused on Thomas's well-being. For his sake, we managed to create a semblance of family unity, even if it was sometimes more performance than reality. 6 months later, Julia met someone new, a doctor who had recently joined a practice in Portland. Within weeks, she approached me with a proposal. She wanted to relocate to Oregon to pursue the relationship. Under the trust terms, if I moved from the house, my share of the proceeds would mostly go to Thomas's education fund, she explained. "I'm fine with that, but I'm concerned about disrupting Thomas's life here." Together with Wilson, we crafted an agreement that would allow Thomas to maintain stability while accommodating both our roles in his life. I would remain in the guest house, which would become my permanent residence, while the main house would be sold with proceeds divided according to the trust provisions. Thomas would live with me during the school year and spend summers and extended holidays with Julia in Portland. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it prioritized Thomas's needs while allowing Julia to move forward with her life. My health, which had deteriorated so dramatically in the months after Richard's death, steadily improved as purpose and joy returned to my life. I joined a grief support group at the local community center, where I formed meaningful friendships with others who understood the journey of loss and recovery. Among them was Eleanor, a retired librarian who had lost her daughter to cancer 3 years earlier. Our shared experiences created a bond that gradually blossomed into a warm companionship that neither of us had expected to find at our age. As Thomas grew, I made it my mission to share with him the traditions and values that had meant so much to Richard. On his 5th birthday, I gave him his first fishing rod, a smaller version of the one Richard had given me that last Christmas. Our fishing expeditions became regular events, first just along the shore, then eventually in the small rowboat I had purchased for our outings. "Did Daddy catch a lot of fish when he was my age?" Thomas would ask, his face serious with concentration as he watched his bobber on the water's surface. "Not at first," I would tell him truthfully. "Fishing takes patience, just like most important things in life. Your daddy learned that early, and it helped him in everything he did." I showed Thomas photographs of Richard at his age, told him stories of his father's childhood adventures, his early fascination with computers, and his love of nature. Through these stories, Richard remained a living presence in his son's life, not just a distant memory or a name mentioned on special occasions. When Thomas turned 7, I took him on his first real camping trip to the Olympic National Forest, to the same site where Richard and I had camped decades earlier. Sitting beside our small campfire, Thomas looked up at the star-filled sky with the same wonder I had once seen on his father's face. "Grandpa," he said thoughtfully, "do you think Dad can see us right now?" The question caught me off guard, but I found myself smiling. "I believe he can," I answered, "not with eyes like ours, but in a way that matters even more." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "That's good," he said, "because I want him to know I remember him, and I want him to see that you're teaching me all the things he would have taught me." In that moment, under the vast canopy of stars with my grandson beside me, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from the devastation of Richard's death to this point had been marked by betrayal, struggle, and loss. Yet it had also revealed the enduring power of love, the strength of family bonds that transcend even death, and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. I have learned that true justice sometimes arrives in unexpected ways, and that the most valuable inheritances are not measured in dollars, but in the values and memories we pass from one generation to the next. Julia's attempt to erase me from Richard's legacy ultimately failed, not because of legal documents or trust provisions, but because the connection between father and son and grandfather and grandson proved more powerful than greed or deception. As I watch Thomas growing into a boy who increasingly resembles his father, not just in appearance, but in his curiosity, integrity, and gentle spirit, I know that Richard's true legacy continues. And in that continuation, there is healing, purpose, and a profound reminder that love outlasts even the deepest betrayal. What would you do if you were in my position? Would you have been able to forgive someone who tried to cut you out of your grandchild's life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Remember that sometimes the greatest justice comes not from vengeance, but from living well and preserving the legacy of those we've lost. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you treasure every moment with your loved ones, for they are truly life's greatest gift.